Okay. Sorry. The screen was frozen for a little bit, so I was a bit confused. First, I want to thank Dr. Romano for inviting me to speak to you. And I'm sad not to be there, but I'm happy to get the chance to present some ideas. So, I hope this is a little bit of a substitute for instead of being there in person. So I'm going to read a text I wrote for about maybe half an hour, and then I very much hope that you have difficult questions for me. So here's the text that I'll read. Raoul Peck opens his new film, The Young Karl Marx, in the forests of Prussia. Peasants gather fallen wood. They look cold and hungry. We hear horses in the distance. The guards and the aristocrats are near. They have come to claim the right to everything in the forest. The peasants run, but they have no energy. They fall. The whips and lances of the aristocrats and the guards strike them. Some of the peasants die. Even fallen wood is not allowed to them. Karl Marx, watching this from Cologne, is dismayed at the violence against the German peasants. The peasants, he wrote, know the punishment. They know exactly what the punishment is. They are being beaten, even killed. But what they do not know is the crime. For what crime are they being punished? This is the question that every sensitive person should ask today. What is the crime for which the world's poor are being punished? Poverty and war produce refugees of hunger and bombardment. But these refugees are denied mobility, denied any exit from their world. They know the punishment that they face, which is starvation, death, and indignity. This they know. What they do not know is their crime. What have they done to deserve this? In fact, what is their crime? US President Donald Trump threatens to annihilate North Korea, Iran, and Venezuela. This is the new axis of evil. The US has already destroyed Iraq and Libya, and of course Haiti and other such countries. Like a wounded dragon, the United States whips its tail across the planet and breathes fire on people, destroying countries, vanquishing its enemies. Catastrophic natural events, hurricanes and rising sea levels capture our imagination as the Caribbean islands are racked by wind and flood, and as the South Sea Islands disappear into the oceans. Data from international agencies show us that formal unemployment has become a general condition for millions of people in the planet. How do we understand a world of unemployment and annihilation, of poverty, climate catastrophe, and war? What concepts do we have to grasp these complex realities? The modes of thought that come from North American positivism, such as game theory, regression analysis, multi-level models, inferential statistics, these are at a loss to offer a general theory of our condition. Seek in common sense understanding of power and naive about the role of elites in our world, these approaches might explain this or that aspect of our world. But can they explain the relationship between the endemic crisis produced by globalization, the failure of neoliberalism to manage this crisis, and the emergence of neo-fascism as its current consensus? Do they have the concepts such as imperialism that are essential to an investigation of the real world that we live in, and not the illusionary world dreamed up by the first principles of bourgeois social science? Do they have an explanation for why the countries of the world spend more money on repression, on war, on security, than on the production of social goods? Why there are more police on our streets than social workers and artists? The word of explanation that I often hear is neoliberalism. It is the magic key. Scholars use it to explain everything. The enemy is Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. It is as if these leaders of the United States and United Kingdom were like sorcerers, conjuring up public policy as if from nowhere, driving their agenda through the institutions of the planet. They championed the privatization of the protected commons and the cannibalization of social resources. That is what we consider to be neoliberalism. But this concept is not enough. We have to go to the structural level to look at the phenomena called globalization. This globalization has been magical. Technological developments, a flood of workers towards capital, and the creation of a new international property regime produced the social force we call globalization. First, new technologies such as satellite communications, computerization, and container ships provided firms with the ability to manage global real-time databases and to move goods as fast as possible. This meant that no longer did capital need to build factories near markets or to build one giant factory. The technological means to disarticulate or break down production to produce a commodity in several places was now available. Second, barriers erected by the October Revolution of 1917, the Chinese Revolution of 1949, and the Third World Project began to tumble in the 1980s because of the debt crisis and the fall of the USSR. Millions of workers, previously sheltered from full-scale capitalist demands, now became prey to the capitalist market. They would wait for this disarticulated factory to descend into their lives. Thirdly, capital went into the final round of the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs in Uruguay to ensure that intellectual property rights would be in the hands of capital rather than in the hands of civilization. Previously, intellectual property was in the process by which a good was produced, not in the good itself. This is called process-based intellectual property. That allowed people to find new ways to make goods and to therefore enhance science and technology. This was most important in the pharmaceutical sector. Now, the new GATT, the last GATT round, which produced the World Trade Organization, allowed the good itself to be patented, which means that capital can collect rent from anyone who makes this good, regardless of their own innovations. It also means that the value of goods produced outside the core territory of capital, let's say North America and Western Europe, will be protected by this new intellectual property regime. This was the legal framework of the architecture of disarticulated or broken up production. These technological developments, the delivery of millions of potential workers, and the new intellectual property rules allowed firms to operate on a global scale. They used two different strategies along what became the so-called global commodity chain. First, they moved their entire production process overseas into one country or another country. This is known as foreign direct investment, or FDI. FDI outsourcing. Here, the multinational firm would still have to invest money elsewhere to build up the physical infrastructure for production. The second way to produce their products, the multinational firm would merely hire subcontractors who would struggle against each other in a race to the bottom. This so-called arm's length outsourcing allowed multinational firms to save their capital and to bear almost no risk in the production process. Either way, by FDI, foreign direct investment, or by arm's length outsourcing, capital found its advantage in labor arbitrage. In other words, finding where wages are cheaper, using cheaper and weaker labor to make its products, while hollowing out societies in the north and south. This new geography of production weakens the power of workers by removing the two main institutional frameworks for the building of worker power. First, trade unions, and second, nationalization. How can workers build unions in these arm's length subcontracted firms which are run on low margins by owners who use means to extract work from replaceable workers? How can states, if they are taken over by workers, nationalize parts of the production process if they do not control the entire process of production of a commodity? Arm's length outsourcing enables firms of the global north to no longer invest their capital into the production process. Nike, Apple, and others like them do not invest money into factories. They are brand firms or brand companies. The profits they make from the rent they gather against their brand is astronomical. And this profit or these profits do not get reinvested into productive enterprises. No wonder then that only 8 men hold as much wealth as the bottom half of humanity. The vast reserves of these 8 men and others like them go in 2 directions: philanthropy and finance, rather than into taxes. One of the most important concepts to consider in our times is that of the tax strike. Those who hold capital, who are masters of profit, have been essentially on strike against regimes of taxation. They use their vast wealth to either hide their money or change tax laws to offer them increasing protections. This vast pool of money is not used in any productive way. It is used to inflate the stock markets of the world and to create various asset bubbles. The turbulence that this can produce was shown in the 2007-2008 explosion of the largest asset bubble to burst as of now, and that is the housing market in the United States. This tax strike has also created a morbid cult of philanthropy, with the rich donor now the hero of our times. And it has created a world of well-paid lobbyists who ensure that democracy is in chains without the necessity of a military coup. As Yanis Varoufakis said, in this day you don't need tanks when you have banks. Tax strikes come alongside the insistence that public officials must balance the books of public finances. Governments must balance their budgets, even as capital reduces its payments into the public treasury. This means that governments are forced to either sell assets to raise funds so as to continue to maintain social institutions. They slice away at these social goods. Fiscal responsibility alongside the tax strike means impoverished government finances. No wonder then that the pressure on society is now moved from the state onto society. What the hidden hand destroyed, the hidden heart had to hold together. The social costs of globalization have started to destroy society, whose loose bonds had to be held together by triple-time labor, mainly from women in families. Modern states, with commitments won by their population through sustained struggle, could not immediately cut all social benefits. Childcare, education, transportation, fresh air, welfare, pensions, all these the people had forced their governments to provide. These were part of the minimum definition of modern civilization. The tax strike and fiscal responsibility ruined public budgets. They simply could not find the means to deliver upon their obligations. Dearly won public assets and non-commodified parts of nature went on the auction block. This privatization raised funds to maintain the tenuous, uneasy finances of the modern state. International entities such as the International Monetary Fund and commercial banks punished states that did not cut deep enough into their public finances, downgrading their bonds, preventing them from raising short-term capital to protect them from the spiral into insolvency, into bankruptcy. The money raised from this privatization was rarely used to invest in infrastructure or produce the means to enhance social wealth. Instead, young people and older workers were forced to pay for their education through debt, as this education was promised as the avenue for individual advancement. Now, it's a fair question to ask, how was the economy to grow? Neoliberal policy bet on letting loose the animal spirits of consumerism, paid for through debt, and from the creation of new technologies and assets that would miraculously increase growth rates and produce social wealth that could somehow be spent on social goods. None of this happened. Instead, consumerism and the emergence of new technologies led to debt. A lot of it was consumer debt, household debt, and the inflated assets led to more turbulence of the global economy. This is a derivative civilization, a civilization founded on trickery and theft. To make the economy grow, ordinary people had to go into debt. The data on poverty in our times is utterly miserable. Let's begin with the fact that 22,000 children die every day from poverty. Every 10 seconds, a child dies of hunger. About half of the world's population lives on less than $2.5 US per day. Household debt rates in much of the world has increased astronomically, which implicates the middle class into a debt-driven consumption pattern. These are miserable implications. The fact that global wealth drawn from the exploitation of social labor has been sequestered, has been seized by very small numbers of people, and that the amelioration of suffering of a very large number of people will be sporadic and insufficient, and frequently the cost is borne inside families. Older categories that have been set aside by social science, such as humiliation, frustration, desolation, alienation, anger, will be needed if we are to understand the condition in the planet of slums. Rather than fight to break the tax strike, the governments of the world turn their energy towards corralling the masses through devices of great ingenuity, of great brilliance. A war on drugs here, a war on terror there, with new vocabulary to suggest the inevitability of the new mechanisms of control. Terms such as security, surveillance, risk mitigation, sensitivity analysis, hazards. Social wealth that could be used to overcome poverty is now moved increasingly to build up the arsenal of security. A report last year from the Institute for Economics and Peace showed that the total cost of violence globally is about $13.5 trillion, with half of this, $6.5 trillion, going to military expenditure and a quarter of this, $3.5 trillion, going to internal security. The total cost of violence amounts to 13.5% of world's gross domestic product. Let me just repeat that. The total cost of violence amounts to 13.5% of the world's gross domestic product. Now, the stated commitment for official development aid is merely 0.7% of gross domestic product, and most countries come nowhere near their official development aid targets. They linger at 0.1 or 0.2%. This discrepancy between 0.1% of the gross domestic product going to development funds and 13.5% of gross domestic product going to security, so-called security, war making, this discrepancy between aid and violence shows that the market has failed. Their signals are wrong. Neoliberal policy, which is essentially starvation of the social side of state policy and the indulgence of the military side of state policy, has little answer to the widening inequality gap and the very deepening sense of despair that grips large parts of the planet. Guns intimidate people, but they do not provide them with any hope for a better future. Fixation on Donald Trump is a natural instinct. He is the most noisy of the strong men, a long line that runs from the Philippines' Duterte through India's Narendra Modi to Turkey's Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Of these men, Trump is in charge of the most powerful state with vast military capabilities and with its power coursing, running through the institutions of international finance and diplomacy. Trump provides a muted opposition to neoliberalism. He does not oppose neoliberal policy in any direct way, since he remains committed to policies to increase economic growth and to shrink the social wage. Substantial critiques of globalization are not found at the policy level, but only at the rhetorical or political level. It is here, in speeches before their constituencies, that Trump and the Euro-fascists gesture toward policies of economic sovereignty. They grumble about job loss and about trade policies. But, like neoliberals, they have no real alternative to globalization. They are trapped by its material contradictions, which are immense profits harvested by multinational corporations that feed the financial structure, while great misery for the mass of the world's population, who produce the social wealth to which they seem to have no claim. What the neo-fascists promise is much weaker than either economic sovereignty structured around nation-states or around the working class. The rhetoric of the neo-fascists sparkles with economic nationalism, but in fact their policy provisions are stuck at the border of cultural nationalism. They obsess over a fantasy of cultural homogeneity, a Europe without minarets and hijabs, the United States without Mexicans. Anti-immigrant sentiment is the platform of their nationalism. Trade ceases to be about the principles of exchange and becomes increasingly about racism. There is little serious conversation here about how productivity rates in the West, driven by technology, has been the leading cause of job loss. Serious economic discussion is by the wayside as the antidote to suffering is suffocated by slogans such as "Build the Wall" and "Muslim ban." This is the cruelty of the neo-fascists. The neo-fascists are under no compulsion to mask their anger, their hatred, to hide behind phrases such as humanitarian intervention or security. They believe in violence and want to use it. Calls for recolonization come alongside calls for the theft of natural resources. They cannot make a world of cultural homogeneity, so they use force to intimidate those who are seen as foreigners, as outsiders, as lesser human beings. Neither neoliberalism nor neo-fascism is capable of moving a human agenda against the contradictions produced by globalization. People are being seen as disposable, as a gated community civilization grafts itself above society. It is a miserable world that confronts us. It is important to say directly that this new architecture of production is maintained by diplomatic and legal extortion as well as military intimidation. When countries do not agree with the institutional arrangements that benefit the largely northern-based multinational firms, or if policies move against property, the full force of the corporate media and the multinational establishment of the North are mobilized into action. The pressure that runs from Venezuela to Iran to North Korea is a visible demonstration of imperialism, namely the extra economic power used by states in an era of hyper-monopoly, arm's-length capitalism. So, the present. What remains before us? Across the planet, there are many strong and powerful movements of the people. Labor struggles and dignity struggles. Fights to defend the right to natural resources and fights to defend the rights to one's own body. These are the main avenues of resistance to the powerful, but they are deeply weakened on two fronts. First, they are largely isolated from each other. And second, there is no captivating horizon of the future that animates all these struggles. Defensiveness is the order of the day. One of our tasks as intellectuals is to learn from these movements, to see what kinds of alternatives they propose, and to build these gestures into a full theory of the future. If we look closely at these movements, we find that they want to bring macroeconomic policy under democratic control. They want to increase social wages. They want to build infrastructure to attend to people's needs. They want to break the tax strike of corporations and the elite. They want to convert banks from private entities into utilities. They want to ensure a livelihood for everyone and housing for all. These are elements of a future. But we have as intellectuals to also recover the idea of the future. There is no debate that there was once a past and that we live in the present. But there is a debate about the future. We know that tomorrow will come, and then the day after that, and then next month, and then next year. But this is seen merely as sequential time, as the present stretching outward. But this is not the idea of the future. The idea of the future requires us to imagine that the present is not going to be eternal, to exist forever. Transformations are possible. New solutions to current problems are necessary. New horizons must be built. Our movements give us an indicator of these horizons. We have to make sure our social sciences are not dulled into the cynicism of the impossible. 30 million people are currently on the threshold of famine. They would like to flee toward food and away from drought, forest fires, and war. Squeezed between the end of livelihood and the refusal to allow migration, the world's poor experience punishment for a crime that is unknown. What did they do to deserve their fate? Why are they being punished when they have not committed a crime? Thanks a lot. So now I suppose there will be questions. Wait for the technology team to work this out.
Gente, as perguntas podem ser entregues para os monitores, a gente vai fazer a tradução direta para ele, então ele faz a resposta da mesma forma como ele fez a palestra.
Pessoal, nós vamos tentar de duas formas. Na primeira, o João que está na cabine ele vai fazer a pergunta em inglês e o ideal é que ao mesmo tempo nós vamos ouvir aqui e o Vijay vai ouvir lá. Se isso não der certo, pode acontecer microfonia, a gente vai fazer de uma seguinte forma, o João vai fazer para ele separado e depois ele faz para o Paulo, tá bom? Para a gente saber o que será respondido. Obrigado, estamos trabalhando nisso. Pessoal, as perguntas podem ser em português também, a gente vai traduzir.
All right, Professor, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, we have two questions for you here.
Okay.
First one, thank you for the presentation, Professor. Listening to your ideas about the implications and the workings of neoliberal policies, I could not help but wonder about the role of the locomotives of the South, as you coined the term in this configuration. How do they fit in this scenario? And how does this discourse of no alternative creates a social acceptance of such a gloomy scenario? Okay.
Yeah, you want me to answer that and then the second? Okay. Okay, fine. So the first question was about the locomotives of the South. In other words, you know, let's say India, Brazil, South Africa, these were the first three. Let's add China, maybe Russia, but let's stay with the first three. You see, interestingly, in 2003, India, Brazil, and South Africa played a very key role in the Cancun negotiations around the question of subsidies, as well in the critique, the strong criticism of intellectual property rights. But at the time, not only was India, Brazil, South Africa able to grow, there were high commodity prices. The governments in these three countries were left of center to some extent, different variations of left of center. At the time, in 2003, say to 2015, 14, 15, there was some hope that these BRICS countries would emerge, not to change the world, but to provide some balancing against the Western order. In other words, after the fall of the Soviet Union, after essentially a considerable surrender by the Chinese from 1992, after the collapse of the Third World Bloc, after these events took place, there was a power vacuum. And the West, led by the United States from about 1991, you can date this from the war against Iraq in 1991, the West pushed its agenda. You know, it was what we call a unipolar situation, suffocated all other possibilities. And at the time, it was quite hopeless, you know, so that the World Social Forum in Brazil had coined the term, you know, another world is possible. I mean, that was almost hope against hope. Another world is possible. But by the time the BRICS arrived, it was my feeling that the BRICS might have provided a ballast, a rebalancing of the world order. In other words, to emerge as a secondary power, to hem in Western power. Now, this had some potential, but the BRICS had great limitations. Firstly, BRICS countries had no alternative ideological view. They could not imagine a future. They remained stuck in the present policy framework of neoliberalism. Secondly, the BRICS countries didn't produce alternative institutions. They wanted to be part of the IMF. They wanted to be part of the World Bank. They wanted to use the SWIFT network to transfer money. I mean, they didn't try to build alternative institutional frameworks. And thirdly, you had the BRICS country unable to mount a significant, let's say, military challenge against the overwhelming force exercised by the United States on a planetary. So the BRICS itself had a problem, but then of course, once in the key BRICS countries, in Brazil and India in particular, the governments moved rightward. Once in India, the far-right government took power 3 years ago, and once in Brazil you had what people call a soft coup. These countries no longer had the internal class configuration to push for rebalancing or to push for an alternative. So in that sense, the BRICS project failed, and now is really languishing. The world is suffering from its absence. But you also now see Russia and China both squeezed at the two ends of Eurasia, emerging as a kind of defensive bloc. When Trump was attacking the North Koreans verbally, and this was during the opening of the UN General Assembly, Russia and China mounted a very little reported naval exercise off the waters of North Korea, as if to suggest, we will provide an umbrella, won't allow you to attack North Korea. The Russian and Chinese have increased their military and their economic ties with each other, and they are now emerging as something of, not an alternative for a new world, but a rebalancing of the world order. In neither the BRICS nor in the Russia-China, new position do you see an alternative. What you see is a defensive bloc against the imperialism that dominates the world order.
Thank you, Professor.
Feedback.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Professor. We have another question for you from our Professor Giorgio. Why do you characterize the US as a wounded dragon? They still dominate with the US dollar and military power.
Yes, that's a very good question. I am not one of those who believes that the era of American power is at an end. I think it's very trivial when people, and I'm thinking of, very great historians and sociologists like Emanuel Wallerstein and others. They have been suggesting that what they call American hegemony is ending, or even American dominance is ending. I think you're quite right, and as I just said, American military power is supreme. Now, the United States can bomb and destroy any country around the planet. It can help to destabilize the country, but it does have a limitation. It can't actually produce the country in its image. And here, Iraq is a very good example. You can bomb the country, you can destroy everything, but you have a hard time controlling it. So Iraq rapidly moves into the Iranian sphere of influence. It's a very curious matter, but there's no question. The United States has overwhelming military domination. And as well, the United States is able to finance its internal economic weakness by exporting the fact that everybody uses the dollars to denote or demarcate world trade. The threats to move to the euro, the threats to move to some alternative currency, let's say a BRICS, call a new currency the BRICS, all of that was a pipe dream. Everybody either returns to the dollar, or if a new currency emerges, basically it's a shadow of the dollar. Nonetheless, the United States is a wounded dragon strategically. You can see this in the last wars that it's been in, and in its own reliance upon this mythical war against terror. I mean, you have a situation now where when the United States went to war against Afghanistan in 2001, there was immense support from the countries of the world. But then, given this preponderance of power, this overwhelming power, there was a sense, let's go and take out Iraq and then perhaps Iran, then we'll get rid of Syria, we'll get rid of this. It's this strategy of war making that suggests the wounded dragon. In other words, this is not smart military or strategic use of power. Now, some people argue, and I don't agree with them, that the United States goes into these wars to sow chaos. I think that's a very wrong approach. It doesn't quite understand that, these approaches that suggest the United States goes into sow chaos, they assume that the United States is almost godlike, that it's omnipresent, omniscient, it makes no mistakes, it's incapable of error. But actually, the hubris of having this vast military has led this country into ridiculous wars based on its own strategy. I'll give you just one example and then I'll stop there. Again, returning to Iraq. Now, the United States decided in 2001 and 2003 to overthrow two governments, one in Afghanistan and one in Iraq. Now, the idea was that this would somehow benefit American power. I remember quite publicly talking about this in 2001, saying that, 2002, if the United States hadn't got rid of the Taliban in Afghanistan, now overthrows the Saddam regime in Iraq, if the United States does that, it is going to give Iran, which is the country in between Afghanistan and Iraq, it is going to give Iran an immense strategic victory. In other words, the United States fought these two wars and Iran emerged as the winner. That is why the United States pushed the fraudulent nuclear sanctions against Iran, basically to hem it back to its borders, but it has not succeeded. I mean, Iran's power now in West Asia is, even to the Iranians, it's quite remarkable. The United States has had to withdraw its proxies from southern Syria to allow Iran to open a road that runs from its border all the way to Beirut, so that Iran can now resupply Hezbollah directly without having to fly arms in. So in this way, I consider its military strategy at least to be that of a wounded dragon.
Thank you for the response, Professor. We have one more here. I would like to know about the article published by the Third World Quarter magazine, which defends a recolonization. By the content of this magazine, of this article, surely there has to have been some financial support by some obscure sector of society that pushed for its publication. Could you please comment on this issue?
Okay. This was a very sad event for me personally. I was a member of the board, editorial board of the Third World Quarterly. I very much believed in its history. It was founded by Altaf Gohar in 1979, a Pakistani journalist. It emerged as a journal at a time when the third world ideas were being essentially constrained. People like important intellectuals like Raul Prebisch from Argentina gave a speech in the late 1970s basically saying we need new ideas for the global south and so on. So this journal emerged in 1979 to be a space for new thinking about imperialism, about power, and about what are the opportunities for countries of the global south to emerge. Very important journal, and I've been happy to be associated with it. Now, without consultation with the editorial board, the editor, managing editor, decided to run this essay called A Case for Colonization, written by an American academic, Bruce Gilley. And the managing editor's argument was he wanted to spur a debate. Now, I'd like to say two things about that. Firstly, I don't mind debates. I'm not against the freedom to have discussion. After all, I'm a Marxist, and Marxists are increasingly a vanishing tribe, and so we are also, of course, experiencing various forms of censorship around the world. So I'm sympathetic to, censorship. But this call to revoke the article was not a question of censorship. Here's how I understood it. This is the first issue about having a debate. Why should the debate happen on terms set by somebody who believes in colonialism? This is like as if I had written an article called A Case for Male Supremacy, where I made the case that men are superior to women. I mean, there are lots of debates to be had about the question of gender roles in our societies. There are lots of debates to be had about the fact that even to this day, women are often working the extra shift when they come home after a job, taking care of families, etc. There are debates to be had, but it is, in my mind, no debate to begin with the idea that men are superior to women. In the same way, you can't start a debate in 2017 on the terms of the colonizer. The debate must happen in a much more humane way. I mean, the other reason I objected to this article very much was that it was essentially a racist article. You see, he says a call for colonization, but all his examples were of Europe and the United States going into the formerly Third World. What about Chinese colonization of Britain? Britain has declining infrastructure. Jeremy Corbyn went on a Virgin train and found there were no seats anywhere. Let the Chinese come and take over Britain. Let the Brazilians go and take over Portugal. But wouldn't that be an interesting idea? Portugal has great problem in its economy. Let Brazil go and take over Portugal. If we want to have a discussion about colonization, why should it be this racist way? So one of my objections was, why should the colonizer set the terms for the discussion? But I doubt very much that the managing editor took any money to run the article. I think it was a misjudgment.
Thank you, Professor. We have one more question from Gustavo, who is a student here. Thank you for speaking, Professor Prashad. The theme of our academic event this week touches on the themes of globalization and nationalism. We know that they are usually considered polar opposites. However, given the current phase of globalization, we see that nationalist movements emerge imbued with racist ideas and xenophobia. Could you please speak about racism in this context of globalization and nationalism?
Well, Gustavo, fortunately that was the thrust of the whole presentation, but let me put it to you very bluntly. Globalization, that is this structure that has been produced of production and wealth around the planet, this immense structure, this reordering of how goods are produced, this reordering of how profit is taken by small numbers of people. This is what I consider globalization. Globalization doesn't mean that in Sao Paulo you have an Indian restaurant. That's not globalization. That's a very trivial way in which some of the media talks about it. Globalization is this new form of social labor around the world being sucked into the production machine at a global scale, and the profits taken by very few people in the world. So that's what globalization is. Globalization is not cosmopolitanism. Let's not mistake it for cosmopolitanism. Being open to other cultures and so on. It's not about that. I mean, does one imagine that when American factories moved to the Mexican border at the maquiladoras, does one imagine that Americans learned anything about the lives, the real lives of Mexicans? I think not. I think the opposite. What happens is, as people begin to find that their lives have been destroyed in the north and in the south, and when they find that the managers of the system, whether the neoliberals or the whoever, have no real solution for the structure of globalization, and they find that the managers have no solution, the Hillary Clintons, the Tony Blairs. In India, it was Manmohan Singh. They have no answers to the exact problem of people of unemployment, despair, the life of slums, etc. Then, if there is no left capable of coming in and saying, we have an agenda. You see, even something as simple, when the Workers' Party in Brazil put forward the idea of zero hunger, that was a flaw underneath starvation, very important policy, which people around the world had studied at the time, thinking this is a replicatable policy and the left can build from this. But when the neoliberals have no solution to globalization, when the left is weak and is weakened further by armed force, by discrediting them through monopoly media, etc., at that point, a space opens up, a very large space opens up for what I consider the neo-fascists to arrive, the Trumps, the Modis, etc. They have no real agenda to improve people's livelihood. They come at people on cultural grounds, on grounds of racism, religious bigotry, and hatred. So the rise of hatred and bigotry in our time is not a surprise to me. It actually is the perfect place which this terrible, unsolved crisis of globalization has brought us.